about black everything.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are joined today by Professor Christopher Tinson, who's Associate Professor of History and the Director of the African American Studies program at St. Louis University. He is the author of the award-winning Radical Intellect, Liberator magazine, and Black Activism in the 1960s, published by our friends down the road, UNC Press. It is the winner of the Pauli Murray Book Prize for Best Book in African American Intellectual History from the African American Intellectual History Society. How you doing, Professor Tinson?
Good to see you.
Pleasure to have you on the show. This is a big book.
Yeah.
And sometimes, we get caught up now talking about black public intellectuals and people on Twitter and on, all that kind of stuff that you know about. But we don't talk as much about African American intellectual history.
Yeah.
And you have found in Liberator, this magazine, that existed in this period of time that, a lot of folks know about the period of time, but they don't necessarily know about the journals from that period of time. That really, I think, is a model for how we can think about creating intellectual spaces even now that are doing that very real work around politics and history, and as you point out, even aesthetics.
Sure.
How did you come to Liberator?
I had seen Liberator anthologized, like parts of it anthologized in different places. Of course, we knew some of the main figures who came through, from Max Stanford, Amiri Baraka was there for a little bit, Dan Watts, people knew a little bit about him. But nobody knew how they came together. Of course, Harold Cruse's work was pivotal in the mid '60s, and he intentionally used Liberator to really kind of think through some of his.
Some of the things.
That's right.
The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual.
That's right. And a lot of those essays led to Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, which was a monumental and still, one of those heavy hitters that everybody goes to when they want to think about black thought in a critical way. And I think I was interested in how they came together, but also just kind of what did they produce together? So what kind of viewpoints, what kind of attitudes, what kind of energies were they able to assemble? And I was just impressed by that because it was also a very, not very well funded outfit, right? So a lot of this stuff was shoestring, a lot of this stuff was people going into their personal pocketbooks to contribute, and really at great sacrifice. So I figured, that story needed to be told. It was mentioned a lot. And so I was like, let's go in and look deeply at what it contributed. And it had a 10-year run. And so I thought that was enough. A monthly periodical for 10 years in the middle of the 60s on a shoestring budget, I thought was worthy of some deep research.
I mean, that budget piece I think is important because, that's the story of all these.
Sure.
I mean, if you're not connected to the Johnson Publishing Company and you're Lerone Bennett, right, and you could do some stuff with Negro Digest and stuff like that because of that Johnson money, if you're Dudley Randall at Broadside or if you're Haki at Third World Press, I mean, it's a struggle. You're doing it for the love of the movement and for the love of trying to push ideas out there.
I really love the independent aspect of it as well. That it kind of set its own rules. I love that period where there was a lot of DIY. I know that's been co-opted now, DIY. But the point is that these folk had to do that work. They also had everyday jobs. Many of these folks weren't academics or, they weren't working at institutions that we work at. They were postal workers, or they were, people working in K through 12 education or trying to do community-based education. And then they would be doing this work at night, on their kitchen tables, at weekends, et cetera. So I love that independent streak, and I think that's a key aspect of black radical thought in this particular period.
At its peak, how widely did it circulate?
It circulated coast to coast, but it was mostly, at its peak, probably about 15,000 copies monthly. So, this is small compared to, this is, especially with the number of things one could get their hands on in the 1960s, from dailies to weekly newspapers. And, we're thinking about Black America here. Folks, they had a lot of resources they could get their hands on. So Liberator was really specific about creating its own niche within the people who were on the left, and then they used those networks to really circulate, and even got some global circulation for a couple of years, mainly through Ghana.
You mentioned that there's a way in which Liberator was proto-Black Power movement, right? I mean, it really is kind of encapsulating some of those arguments before they become more fully fleshed out.
Sure.
You also talk about in the early days, so much of the focus is actually on what's happening in terms of African independence and talking about African intellectuals here in the United States. We don't find as much as that, the interest among African Americans in African politics the same way. Clearly, we don't think about African intellectuals in the same way.
Sure.
What do you attribute that shift to, and why was it so important for the founders of Liberator?
For Liberator, one, they're based in New York. The period that I focus on is the early 60s through the early 70s, but the clock needs to really move back a little bit further to the formation of the United Nations and the way in which black radicals, or black liberals for that matter, saw the United Nations as a space to really articulate some demands. Human rights, that's right. So the Liberator folks are kind of coming of age when the United Nations is really trying to get its footing. One of the people that I like to think about as an intellectual, kind of benefactor, if you will, to folks who come through Liberator is William Patterson and his We Charge Genocide campaign in the 1950s. Was really, doing work from the left, really thinking about deep structural changes. The folks who began to start Liberator in the late 50s and the early 60s really are mirroring and trying to pick up on that era of Du Bois, Robeson, Alpheus Hunton, Islanda Robeson, et cetera, as well as Patterson. They're trying to carry that work forward into the 1960s. And so many of them, one, saw that work as important to continue, but the other part was African independence was critical. And one of the main catalysts for Liberator's specific formation was the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. And so being in New York City, being in the Cold War, being at a time where the Kennedy administration is trying to recruit a lot of African intellectuals.
Castro's coming to New York and going up to Harlem.
That's right. There was this kind of global, mushrooming, of international thinking around these questions. Which way is the world going to head? And I think Liberator folks saw themselves as important to give voice to perhaps some African independent countries who couldn't really speak truth to the West. And so they saw themselves as kind of the go-between. That's right. And they were successful, and then in many respects they failed because they didn't have the resources to actually support these folk. But they did a lot on their own, to really do that work.
When you think about some of the icons from the period, how aware were Malcolm X or say Martin Luther King of Liberator?
King probably didn't like Liberator very much. I know people in SNCC were reading it, and mainly that was from the work that RAM, Revolutionary Action Movement, was doing. And even though it was a clandestine organization by its formation, they sent Max Stanford and Askia Touré down to the South to really do this work. And they would carry, periodicals from Detroit and New York and all the time. And so there was an emphasis on really trying to infiltrate the Southern movement with some left thought. In terms of Malcolm certainly knew about Liberator, to the degree that it saw itself as a New York City publication. They reached out to Malcolm. One of the early interviews they did was in 1962 after the Ronald Stokes murder in Los Angeles. And Malcolm, that's the first time Liberator really talks about Malcolm as potentially this leader. They saw him as just like any other firebrand in New York City for a long time. And they were very skeptical of the work that the Nation of Islam was doing.
Of course,
because they were on the left, they saw themselves as kind of...
very conservative.
That's right.
Socially conservative and a range of other things.
Exactly. So they were very suspicious, very down on the idea that you could organize a political movement through the mosque. And,
or any religious organization for that matter.
And so, so Malcolm definitely knew about them. They were, some of the folks, of course, Harold Cruse, of course, early on, John Henry Clark was a part of it. We know Malcolm's relationship with John Henry Clark. So there was a lot of cross-fertilization, man. This period is one of those periods that's really rich, and people really couldn't ignore each other in that way, so.
It's, interesting. I'm thinking about for a moment the work of someone like Ashley Farmer. Who's really highlighted the way that women played a role in what we think of as these sexist organizations, But they actually have a hands-on role shaping it and built spaces outside of these organizations to actually think about feminist policies and feminist thought. What did that look like in the context of Liberator?
Liberator was a male-dominated space for the most part. But when I look closer, and what I mean by male-dominated, we talk about the organizational infrastructure, saying who has a title, for example. you won't see many women listed as the kind of editors
Right
in
on
chief.
the masthead.
Exactly.
Right.
However, when you look in the pages, you will see a lot of representation of women's activism consistently from the entire decade, throughout the entire decade. And so I spent one whole chapter really just kind of honing in on that.
Yeah.
Not to say you're just going to isolate women's activism to one chapter. They actually diffuse throughout the book. But the point is, I wanted to really signal this point, because from the outside, Liberator does look, masculine, does look like it's ignoring women's voices. But when we look closely, we see there's a number of people, and a lot of these folks didn't become stars in the literary world. A lot of these folk were everyday folk. There was a ton of letters to the editor that I looked at where people were commenting, and Dan Watts would actually publish that. Publish it as is, whether it was critical or not. And one of the people I really spent a lot of time on in terms of impacting Liberator was Lorraine Hansberry. And there's obviously Monty Perry has some new work on Lorraine Hansberry, and I'm looking forward to that getting a whole lot of circulation. But Lorraine Hansberry was coming out of that left milieu that a lot of these folks were a part of. There was a lot of people in and out of the committees for the Negro in architecture. And there was another committee for the Negro in the arts, for the advancement of the Negro in the arts. And that was pretty much ran by women, B. Richards and many others. So the aesthetic, the political is something that I thought was very important, but I also didn't want to make it seem that the women only wrote about aesthetic issues. But there was a lot of conversation about that. But many of them were holding forth on deep political issues around anti-militarization during the Cold War, anti-nuclear organizing, as well as local politics and education reform.
You're visiting Duke to give a lecture in honor of winning the Book Prize award from AHIS, as we affectionately call it, the Pauli Murray Book Prize award. And I'll just be honest, from my vantage, the African American Intellectual History Society has really changed the game. It is taken the discourse of Black history clearly, but also Black studies and Black ideas. It's international focus as well. The incredible focus on gender within that context. There's a way in which there's a deep connection between this book award and what Liberator represented and what AHIS is trying to do now. Do you ever get discouraged by the lack? I mean, you mentioned the richness of the 1960s, where everybody was willing to really go at each other. Right, in the spirit of making something better. And there was always some shade, somewhere in the mix, but, folks were deeply committed to making sure they read each other's work. That if I was going to take you on, I'm going to take you on respectfully by actually reading your arguments. Do you sense that same kind of richness in the moment that we're in now?
It's tough. It's tough to see, because I think that there's spots where you certainly would want more of that. But we've probably gotten a little more sensitive in terms of public intellectual work, where people's reputations are on the line and things of that nature that will make people more hesitant to really just go for the jugular, unless pressed to do so. But I think there's a way in which what I take your question to mean is a deep commitment to critical intellectual thought and to scaffolding knowledge, and the way in which difficult conversations need to be had about our work in order to propel the work forward. These activists and these scholars here were all about that. And so it remains to be seen, how we take up that mantle, but I do find it's out there. The space that Intellectual History Society has created with the blog Black Perspective is really important to kind of facilitating that conversation forward and pushing it forward, and also democratizing knowledge. I think one of the things where I see a common thread with people like Liberator, Negro Digest, and others is this effort to really democratize knowledge. Who's the scholars, right? How are the scholars in the conversation with the local community and with a broader public? And how do we shape a kind of critical intellectual public? And I think that in that way, there's both a lot of work that has been done and a lot of work that remains to be done.
The system of reward is also very different. You think about this particular moment and what it means to have 100,000 Twitter followers,
Sure.
right? Or for some tweet of yours to go viral.
Yes.
I mean, all
Yes.
those kinds of things that are not necessarily on the table. And this is not as if, the folks working with Liberator and some of these other journals in the 1960s didn't appreciate acknowledgement of their work.
Right.
But that wasn't a kind of guiding metaphor,
Right.
For it. And I think about this moment now just in terms of the fact that, most folks are not likely to want to go the independent route.
Right.
Right. It's like if you have an option of like, and this is like a very real question for some folks, do you want your piece at Black Perspectives or do you want it in the New York Times?
Sure. Right.
And the New York Times gives you a kind of platform that obviously Black Perspectives can't give you. But at the same time, what does it mean to be able to give your work to someplace, that is committed to the movement, that is Black owned in some sense?
That's right.
I always appreciated looking at the career of someone like Manning Marable, who for the longest time is doing his Beyond the Color Line column and offering it up for free to the Black press.
That's right.
To make sure his voice connected to actual
And it got
Black
everywhere.
people. And it got everywhere.
That's right. No, I think that's a very important point. I mean, this is one of the entanglements that we find ourselves with after this period, right? Because what ends up happening is people get plucked into the mainstream, and other people don't, right? And so, the difference between a Baraka and say some other New Jersey poet, we wouldn't. There's no fair comparison because Baraka just became the man.
Right.
But I think in that instance, he deserved it, right? Like I think
Baraka legit, right?
Was he could carry the mantle, but I also think that there's a way in which mainstream literary society or just the reading public, if you will, they handpick which of the
stars get
which
created.
of the stars, right?
Right.
We saw that going on with Ta-Nehisi, right?
Right.
And so every 10 or 15 years we go through,
Because even with the Ta-Nehisi, I mean, the people who knew Ta-Nehisi and his writing were like, okay, right? We get it, right? But there are a fair amount of people in America, even Black folks, who had no idea who Ta-Nehisi was. Like, who's this?
Exactly. Exactly. They probably thought he was African, like from the continent.
Because I think about, I talk to young cats now, and you just kind of read stuff, and it's like, I look at a figure like someone like Hakeem Mahmoudi, and how many young folks don't really know who he is.
It's a problem.
And what he built.
It's a problem. It's a problem. And I think it's one of those things where when we take our, say, Intro to Africana Studies class, how do we walk students through
because it's so
who
much.
are the pioneers?
Because there's so much.
And there's so much stuff, and everything seems important now. I mean, that's the other part about our period that we're in. Hyper technology, everything is so important. So students are having trouble figuring out what they need to know and just what they can know to move through the world. And I think that that's a very interesting space because I feel, to your point, we might be losing out on a number of key thinkers, and the spread of their work will be diminished because of that, and almost forgotten, unfortunately. And that's why another reason to write about Liberator is I didn't want to write about all the well-known figures. I wanted to bring to light some of the figures who were very instrumental, who not that many people knew about, but who were doing some very, very important and signature work that should get attention. And so that's part of the thing. But I do think we're in a difficult point now where we're fighting so much information that people are having trouble remembering the pioneers. I mean, Lerone Bennett is another one. Did a number of for a long time.
Right? I mean,
using
and
those
he kept
pages.
that voice as long as he was writing for Ebony.
That's right.
He kept a little bit of that voice.
That's
right. I think about someone like Vincent Harding.
That's right.
In that context, right? Both in terms of his own work as a historian, but also his relationship with King, his relationship with the independent Black think tank in Atlanta. I mean, it's like we forget about those stories.
No, and I think, and other folks like Tony Cade, for example, and one of the joys about writing this book was like it gave me a chance to really talk about Tony Cade Bambara because many people didn't know that, as a younger writer, she wrote for Liberator, and so then she becomes, a major storyteller, novelist, right?
And
exactly.
Gorilla My Love, and
And so seeing that genealogy, I think, is really important, and kind of, seeing that people didn't always come, they weren't always chosen. They worked at their craft.
Right.
They were committed to community,
Right.
and they were able to do good work and make a career for themselves. And I think we should celebrate that.
As you were going through the archive, were there any things that really surprised you in terms of stuff that you found?
Well, I was really thinking about the day we're in now, and also, how it corresponded with the day that the Liberator found itself in. And I'm thinking about the way in which the continuation of questions around police brutality and police reform,
Still relevant.
education reform, political representation, 40 years out, we're still talking about the same thing. So I was struck by that, but I was also struck by the fact that they were really committed against what would be called the carceral state. They were working against the carceral state even then. And it really was looking at police reform as that lens, but they were also going in on imprisonment and really talking about how imprisonment in some senses is a continuation of Jim Crow and all these other things, going back to enslavement. So I think I was really impressed by that. I was also struck by the way in which they were able to get their message out to a larger audience from a shoestring budget, as we mentioned earlier, but also the local communities of connection. So the relationship between a New York and a Detroit, and the relationship between Detroit and Oakland, California.
Yeah, right.
And I was really impressed by how they were able to kind of fashion these networks, these translocal networks of activity that I think is really impressive, even for today.
Yeah, right.
We would do things slightly differently, obviously, with our technology, but I think just this idea of having pockets of energy that you can kind of get off a plane somewhere.
In every major city.
That's right, in every major city, and go to a meeting and get connected to local community and then continue the work was, I think, part of, part of the success of the magazine.
And that's the challenge of the social media movement, right, for us. I mean, these folks had to have face-to-face relationships with folks, right? They had to they had to sit at tables with folks, and for all the value that social media has brought to this moment, right, we don't do as much as that kind of work anymore.
Right, unfortunately, I mean, I would love to sit across from Harold Cruse, but I think, after 5 minutes, I'll be like, all right. And I think a lot of folks.
It's like, can I mute you?
Yeah. I think a lot of folks, they love the contribution that a lot of these folks brought. Right. But, not everybody got along, and not everybody liked each other, not everybody agreed. And I think that's the other thing I appreciated about this is that, even though people could say, hey, we're on the left or we're part of a black radical tradition, or we consider ourselves black radicals, we don't all agree necessarily, and we don't have to necessarily, but we do agree that, structures have to change, that, democracy must be widespread to the extent that they believed in democracy, right? I think that was an earlier generation. These folks were really talking about anti-imperial politics and anti-colonial politics. And I think that that's a very interesting kind of positioning.
Yeah, what are you reading these days?
Everything I get my hands on. I just got in the mail Upending the Ivory Tower by Stephen Bradley. I also just got Looking for Lorraine. So I'm looking forward to diving into that with Imani Perry. In terms of other things, just to keep my mind flowing, I'm kind of a nerd like you, and I'm probably reading the Washington Post, the New York Times, the New Yorker. I'm trying to read everything.
I mean, there is a richness to that part of it now, like where we just have at our hand, in our hands, access to so much information.
And I don't get, unfortunately, I don't get a chance to sit down with the Sunday Times like I used to. You know what I'm saying? But I think it's okay.
Well, that's what happens when you become a successful academic.
I don't know how successful I am, but I'm happy to be working, man. So.
You've been watching Left of Black. We were joined today by Professor Christopher Tinson, who is Associate Professor of History and the Director of the African American Studies Program at St. Louis University, and the author of the award-winning Radical Intellect, Liberator magazine, and Black Activism in the 1960s, published by UNC Press. Man, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black, culture over everything.